22 tips for mastering groups in Revit. So this is a follow-on video from the previous video, which I completed during the week, which was more of an introductory to groups, how they work, how to set them up, how to copy them around the model, that kind of thing. This is much more of a nitty-gritty that will go into particular use cases of groups within the Revit models, how you can leverage groups in certain ways that you may not be aware of, and certain caveats or things to be aware of that groups can cause, let's say they could be problematic in certain instances. So it's just to make you aware and cognizant of the potential issues before you get meaningfully started, particularly if you're trying to run a very large or controlled project. All right. So as always, if you like this content, you know what to do below. Hit the like or subscribe. Any additional tips that I may have missed, leave them down below. I might learn a thing or two, but more importantly, hopefully someone who's come across the video will learn something as well. All right. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it. So tip 1, schedule model groups in Revit. Okay, so looking at the screen here, okay, we have the model from the previous video again. Okay, if you want to actually go along with the tutorial here, this model is available from a download link in the description. Okay, so looking at this, you can see that we actually have two distinct group types in this project. Okay, we have our office arrangement A on the north, east and west, and then on the south, east and west we have office arrangement group B. Okay, and we have a total of two types of groups that are arrayed twice each in the project, or copied or mirrored twice each. Okay, now you can imagine that, okay, this is a very slimmed down example of the number of groups that you could have in a project, but you may actually have potentially hundreds of group instances in a project, and it's worth knowing that you can actually track this information via schedules within Revit itself. So as of 2018, they implemented the ability to include groups within as a schedule component. Okay, so going to schedule quantities, okay, you can navigate down on your category to model groups, and we're going to call this model group schedule test. Okay. And from here, you can see that we have the schedule building components button here, and I'm going to press OK. Now, you can see that I got a couple of COBie requirements fields here, but that's okay. We're not going to concern ourselves. You will probably have 4 items, which will be the type, the reference level, the origin level, offset, and the count. Okay. So I'm going to include all of these in our schedule. Okay. And I'm going to press OK. And as you can see, very simply, we have the full remit of the groups present in the file already applied to a schedule. Okay, so you can imagine if we have hundreds of instances across the project, we could do this very easily. What's even better then is we could actually potentially sort and group this if we wish by, for example, reference level, and we can press OK. And because it's all reference level 0, that's fine. But if you had reference level 0, 1, 2, 3, it would actually break down the groups into their associated host level as well. So that was tip 1 on how to schedule model groups in Revit. Tip 2, nested groups in Revit. So Revit has the capacity to nest groups within larger groups. Okay, and this is a testy subject. So what I would say to you is, if you look at the example here on the northeast side of the building, you can see that we have our office arrangement A. Okay, and since the last step, what I've done is I've actually introduced canteen area as an independent group, which is now nested within that. Okay, so I can say edit group, and when I select one element from the canteen, the full kitchen group is visible. Okay, so this is a group which is nested within a larger group. Okay, so my statement to you on this is as follows. Make sure that if you need to use nested groups, so let's say you have something like a hotel and you've got repeating room arrangements all over the place. You might have 100 of the same room, and within that room you have the same bathroom construction, the same set out and everything. Okay, you may wish for the initial array around the building in the early design stages to have the bathroom within the hotel suite as an independent nested group. Okay, and what I can say to you is that the efficiency gain from that is that, for example, I can go within the nested group, okay, and I can change elements specific to just the nested group on its own, and you can see it'll duplicate across all nested groups within the larger groups. The difficulty with this is that as the project develops, you can have a depth of nested groups that becomes a bit of a wormhole as such. You know, it's a black hole of productivity. You end up having to click into the initial group to edit the group, then you have to click into the nested group to edit that nested group, and then you could have supplementary elements within the nested group again, which you would have to go into again, okay? And what happens is then, in order to make wholesale changes, it becomes less efficient. So my suggestion to you is, in the early stages of design development, when things are in motion, you can group elements with maybe one or two supplementary nested groups within the larger group. And then once you are relatively content with the overall setting out, remove the nested group from the primary main group and have that as an independent group that can be edited. So you've arrayed it everywhere it needs to be, and it's correct relative to the primary group at all times. But now you've taken it out of the primary group, and it's its own independent group, which can be edited freely, and all instances will still continue to update throughout, okay? Finally, it's kind of worth noting that with the nested groups themselves, you have this kind of situation that within the group edit dialog, generally, you don't have as many tools. You can see that many of the tools are automatically grayed out. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And the reason for this, like this becomes a problem then later on in the project when you need to start developing more information off the back of the scheme design that you've generated. You've lost a lot of the functionality within the edit group dialog. So you really don't want to have too many elements nested, because not only does it become inefficient over time, but it also becomes very difficult to work within, and you constrain yourself maybe more than you would otherwise choose to. So that was tip 2 about nesting groups in Revit. Tip 3, you can attach multiple different types of attached detail groups into a single Revit model group. Okay, so as you can see again, we have the northeast and northwest arrangements here, and this is the same group. This is the model arrangement A. Okay, and so these two are the same groups, and as you can see, when we select the associated attached detail groups, we have office arrangement A, arrangement A. Okay, so this arrangement A is the name of the attached detail group, and office arrangement A up here is the parent model group that it belongs to. Okay, now what's interesting about this is you can actually have multiple sets of attached detail groups that are applicable to this one model group. So for example, you may have a planning application or something like a tender going out, or a pricing exercise going out, where you'd want to show the generic information such as the wall tags and door tags and that kind of thing, right? But let's say on the left hand side, you have a different set of concurrent drawings within the project that are getting ready for a fire safety certificate review, okay? And you need to show the fire ratings. You don't necessarily need to show the fire ratings as a default on the tender information, but you will need to show it on the fire safety certificate. So what we can do with our office arrangements here, okay, so I can say edit type, and on the arrangement A of the attached detail group, I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm going to call it arrangement A fire. Okay, I'm going to press OK and press OK. All right. So on the right hand group, we have associated the arrangement A, the original attached detail group, and on the left hand side now we have this new attached detail group, which is still applicable to the same geometry. All right. And the great thing about this is we can go in and edit group, and I can select, let's say, all instances of the wall tags for argument's sake. And I can quickly change them down to our fire rating tags. Okay. So you can see some of the walls are fire rated and some are not. And I can press finish. Okay. And as you can see now, we have actually applied two different sets of attached detail groups to the same model group for different use cases. And again, through other groups, even our secondary B group, if we wished, we could select our arrangement A off the back of that and duplicate this one. Okay, so it's very interesting to know that you can have attached detail groups, for different use cases without any edits that have to happen to the model groups at all. Okay, so that's just something to be aware of, and it's something that's very, very functionally useful. So that was tip 2, having multiple attached detail groups per model group. Tip 4, mirroring groups in Revit. Mirroring groups in Revit is a bit of a mixed bag. It can be beneficial and it can be really, really damaging. So as a rule, I'm not the biggest fan of mirroring groups, okay? I think for early project development, schematic design, it's not make or break, but you need to be cognizant of what you're doing when you're mirroring the groups and the effects that it can have in the overall project. So looking at this arrangement here, this is our northeast arrangement again, okay? And just on the top-down view here, you can see that we have our standard workstations, we have our keyboards, for example, all right? So this is the standard arrangement for a keyboard, whether or not you're left or right-handed, this is what a keyboard is, okay? But in our example model here, I had mirrored, this first group across the center grid line D onto the other side. And if you look down, we actually have the reverse image of all of our group geometry, okay? Now, obviously, a keyboard is not necessarily going to make or break the scheme, okay? But if you imagine you've plumbed your hot and cold water for a sink, and it was, let's say, along this wall here, and we mirrored it on this point, your plumbing arrangements are going to be back to front, which means if the contractor follows your information blindly on site, there'll be remedial costs that'll have to be compensated for, because you'll have your hot going to the cold and cold going to the hot. Now, if you imagine what that happens at kind of like a mechanical electrical process level across something like a pharmaceutical facility or something like that, and you have a series of groups and then you start mirroring them, that is a catastrophic thing to have happened. All right. There's other considerations more from the practical Revit perspective that you need to be cognizant of. Ceilings don't mirror well. Let's say if I had a ceiling over this arrangement on the right hand side and I mirrored it across to the left hand side, that ceiling's alignment will just mess up. There's no real reason for it. It just will lose the association of the alignment on the surface patterns. I don't really understand why. It's been that way since as long as I can remember. All right. So generally, my advice is try not to mirror groups where possible. Try have a left-handed and a right-handed variant of each. So for example, in this instance, I should have actually put a left and right handling for each of these respectively, so that my workstation arrangements would be correct. All right. So it's just something to be cognizant of. Mirroring, while it's quick, has its problems, and mirroring in groups generally should try to be avoided where possible. All right. So that was tip 4, mirroring groups in Revit. Tip 5, keep your Revit groups on the level. All right. So this is more than just a term of phrase. Really, you should ideally have all of your groups associated to, not all of your groups associated to a level necessarily, but all of your elements within the group should be associated to the single level, should be hosted off of one level. You should avoid having elements of a group that stagger up through a building at different levels. There's a couple of reasons for that. So first of all, if you imagine that something like this arrangement here, and we had an inconsistent floor arrangement above it, but we had, let's say, one element on the first floor that we wanted to array around, it's not necessarily going to coordinate well against the floor above. Now, you may have a very rigidly controlled project where you have every level is kind of like you've got subsections that across levels are the same, and you may want to group all of them. It is still non-advisable to do so. Okay. There's a bit of a problem that you might have something like elements can misbehave essentially when you're moving them, when you've got groups across levels. So line-based families, for example, they break or they get confused about their associated host level when let's say you have multiple line-based families that are spread across multiple levels within one group, they will actually disassociate and start placing randomly across the levels, okay? So that's something really to be concerned of. As a working principle, try keep your grouped elements on the same level. And even if you have a repeating arrangement of the building going vertically, you should still parcel that into per level groups and then do it as a single instance. So that's just, it's just a working note. Make sure to keep your Revit groups and all elements within the groups on the single host level, not across multiple levels. Tip 6. Fix groups dialog in Revit does not fix the group. So if you're familiar with this message that's on screen, you may get something like this when you're working with groups, okay? And as a rule, I think the intuitive thing is obviously follow the dialog and click fix groups. Don't follow the dialog. Ignore your intuition. The program makes an absolute hames of it, so it does. So what we have, this typically arises from model in place families or sketch based families within a group, okay? And they tend to be the primary problem, okay? And when you press fix groups, it does one of two things. It either disassociates from the original group and creates a new group, which is a nightmare if you have everything scheduled and you're trying to run through project controls and that kind of thing. Particularly if it happens in multiple instances. Let's say, again, using the hotel room example, you could have 100, if not more, hotel rooms, and then you fix a group and suddenly you've broken 100 groups, okay? And further to that, what's even worse is sometimes it doesn't even create a new group. It actually just explodes the group and gets rid of everything. All right. So listen, tip number 6, listen to this one. Never fix the group in Revit. All right. Go into the group and try to identify the problem manually and rectify it. Don't use the Revit fix groups dialog. Tip 7, be wary of sketch base or in place families within groups. So building off the back of tip 6, where we were discussing the difficulties with the fixed group dialogues, okay? One of the primary reasons that Revit seems to have difficulties with groups are due to in-place model elements or sketch-based families. So think floors, ceilings, ramps, stairs, that kind of thing. Anything that's sketch-based to generate can be really problematic in Revit, okay? And there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, let's look at this example here, okay? We have this group present, and let's say, for argument's sake, I had a floor finish that I wanted to include as part of this group, okay? So going into the group, I'm going to edit group, and I'm going to go to architecture, and I'm going to select floor. Hopefully I have, no, I'm going to have to create a floor finish. Give me a second. Duplicate, so I'm just going to call this 10 mil, all right? And edit, and I'm not going to worry about the build up at the moment. I'm just going to change it to 10. Okay. So let's say, for example, we wanted to create this floor, okay, within this floor finish within the meeting room here, okay. Things to be cognizant of. First of all, let's say we drew the boundary like this, okay, and then we started to use the align tool, okay. So aligning to this wall makes sense. Aligning to this wall makes sense. But when you get to these boundary and party walls, you have to be very careful, okay? When you align, make sure to never lock, okay? So you could lock to the two inner walls here if you wished, okay? But because you're working to a boundary or a party wall, that wall might vary throughout the project. And just to give you an example, okay? If I finish this sketch here, this is a different group, mind you, but this was originally built off the back of this group, okay? And if you actually look, our boundary wall is different. So we have a party wall here, but we have a boundary wall here. The setting out of that is different because the wall size is different. It's variable. So if you locked to that, it would break over here, okay? Another thing to be wary of, outside of just not locking the elements relative to geometry outside of the groups, is that generating in-place families or sketch-based families within the group is known to be the precursor or the primary precursor to the Revit notorious fixed groups dialog. Okay, so as a rule, rather than generating it in the edit group as we've done it here, okay, we should actually cancel that, and we should cancel the group edit, and then we should, in our architectural tab, selecting floor again. Okay, oh, I forgot to save that floor type. Never mind, we're just going to fire on. We should draft it now. Okay, so let's say I'm drafting from here to here. Okay, ensuring nothing is pinned. Okay, I could, if I wanted to, again, I could pin it to the inner walls because they're part of the group, but we shouldn't pin it to anything outside of the group elements. Okay, but now that I've completed that floor, okay, you should add it then retrospectively to the group. Okay, so on edit group, I can add, and then I can select the floor. Okay, and press finished. Okay, and it should not give us the warnings or the fixed groups dialog if we generate it in that way. Again, if we were generating it directly within the edit group dialog so that it's automatically part of the group, we come into problems. It seems to just cause a bit of I don't know, noise or something for the Revit model in the processing, and it creates the fixed group dialog. Okay, so that's tip 7, things to be wary of when using in-place model family elements or sketch-based elements within groups. Tip 8, Revit groups can be used temporarily just to improve modeling efficiency and then removed afterwards. Okay, so moving off to the side here, we have our standard desking arrangement here that we want to copy. And let's say actually we had a series of other larger open plan offices. Okay, so what we may choose to do here is we may choose to actually group just the desking arrangements there temporarily. Okay, so I'm going to call this workstation group. Okay, so that we can quickly array multiple instances of this throughout the project. Okay, and let's say finally we are happy with the number of instances we populated around the project. Now, bear in mind I'm only using a desk here, but this may be far more efficient for something like, again, using the bathroom example within a hotel. Okay, now let's say temporarily we need to make a couple of changes in the group, so we actually don't want this this arrangement here. So because we have a mirror image, well, let's say we have this open plan, but this is meant to be a corridor for circulation. We may choose that we want this group to be different. Okay, so we're going to say edit group here, and we're going to duplicate this group, and we're going to call this group I don't like using numbers, so try to use letters where possible. Okay, press, and then I'm going to say edit group, and here I'm going to select these, and I'm going to mirror them, apologies, without copying across the center point here. Okay, I'm going to finish, and then I can select the other instances of the group and change that to, and as you can see, finally we can select all those and we can ungroup and ungroup. And what we have done is we've been able to speed up our drafting efficiency by temporarily using groups. Now, this involves a great level of control. You need to be cognizant of the fact you're doing this, and you need to ensure that once you are content with the group's placement throughout the model, that now is the time to ungroup these smaller groups or these elements and either amalgamate them as part of a greater grouping scheme or just leave them be. All right. So they can be used to leverage your modeling efficiency, but again, as always, use them with caution because you don't want to overpopulate your file with model groups. Finally, if I go into my schedules and quantities and I go to my model group schedule test, you can see that because I've ungrouped those elements, we now no longer have those workstation elements within the schedule. All right, so the moment that you remove or ungroup all instances of the group, it actually falls away from the project information entirely. Similarly to what assemblies would do as well. Okay, so that's tip 8, using Revit groups temporarily to improve modeling efficiency. Tip 9, be intentional about the size of your Revit groups. So looking at our workstation example here, okay, this may work better as a system family, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on, but even in a temporary sense, it may work well as a group. But what we need to be aware of is the processing power that's required to array and duplicate groups, and more importantly, to make edits across a host of groups as well, okay? And really what we need to do is try to be cognizant about the number of groups that we are developing and the size of the groups, you know? So for example, this should not be a group, needless to say, okay? However, something like this may make sense as a group, okay? And you can even just see from the selection the difference in the processing ability for the program, okay? So the more controlled you are over the size of your groups, the less, let's say, heavy processing Revit needs to do, heavy calculations, and the less likely you are to have model corruptions and crashes and freezes and that kind of thing, all right? Particularly model corruptions. We can all get over a freeze here or there, but model corruptions are an unacceptable eventuality, all right? Finally, try to think about the family data that you're bringing in, okay? Don't have the family data too complex, okay? Make sure that it is appropriate for your use case in accordance with your LOIN for your project. Make sure your LOD or your level of definition is defined and that your families are in line with your level of definition. Just because you find a beautiful family on Revit City doesn't mean it should be used, all right? This is a design tool for the production of construction information. It is not just a presentation tool, and the former is more important than the latter, okay? So don't take in a 10 megabyte family when you can take in a 100 kilobyte family. Simple as. So tip 10, hosting and hosted elements need to both be present in a Revit group, okay? So needless to say, if you have an element that is a hosted element, the host of that element also needs to be combined in the group. Otherwise, when you copy it to other locations, if there's not a host there ready for it, there'll be nothing for it to append to. So working through a quick example here, let's say that we want these two doors to become part of a group in their own right, okay? So I can select them and I can press group and we'll just call them double doors, okay? Now, the problem with this is, let's say I wanted to copy them out over here, or I wanted to mirror them because they're relatively safe objects to mirror in the grouping context, okay? So I can mirror, pick axis, I'm going to make sure copy is selected, and I'm going to press grid line G over here, so they should populate over here. Needless to say, we're going to get a warning saying the last member of the group instance was excluded, aka deleted, removed, or moved to the project, okay? Group instance has been deleted because there was nothing for the hosted elements to remain hosted to when we mirrored it or we copied it or we moved it away. The group automatically either drops it, excludes those elements from the group if it's part of a greater group, or in this instance, because they were the only two elements in the group, it deleted the group entirely. All right, so you need to ensure that your wall, your hosting walls, apologies, sorry, let me select the edit group, okay? I'm going to pick the two party, basic wall, not be added to the instance model group double doors because of the following reasons. The host element cannot be added to the group. Okay, sorry, apologies. Okay, so I'm going to ungroup this, and then I'm going to select these and press group. There we go, and we're going to say double doors with hosts. Okay, and I'm going to mirror around this point, and you can see that the whole arrangement goes over and it maintains its proper association to the group as well. Okay, so that was tip 10. Both hosted and hosting elements need to be present in a Revit model group. Tip number 11, do not constrain your group elements to elements outside of the group, okay? So looking on screen here at the moment, we have this little kind of workstation example again, okay? And I've called this constraints group for reference, okay? And as you can see, I've dimensioned this to the middle of this window, okay? So there's one of two things that can happen if you actually constrain your data to elements outside of the group, okay? So first of all, again, going back to the sketch-based families, if you had used the lock, you may break or change the state of the group as it's copied around when the wall that it's meant to attach to has changed. Similarly, in this case, if we were to set this out in different places across the model, this group, without this constraint, you can actually break the setting out of the group. But more importantly than potentially damaging the group, okay, I like to think of the group as a secondary hierarchy, whereas Revit identifies group as a primary hierarchy. I would think of the external elements to the group as being standalone and more important from the project information perspective than the group elements themselves. So for example, again, going back to the hotel or apartment, you have the boundary and the party walls, and then you would have the group as the infill elements. You don't want the group to negatively change the state of the boundary or the party walls. They're actually the confining elements, okay? However, Revit recognizes group as a higher hierarchy. So unfortunately, you can see that I have this locked here, this dimension locked here. And ideally what we would want is that this state wouldn't change, okay? So let's say this isn't pinned in place, for example, this group. So because I have a constraint against the external geometry, Revit is recognizing the group as a higher priority item or higher hierarchical item than I would like it to be, or most users would like it to be. We would like the party wall or the building envelope or whatever it is to have a higher priority than the elements within it. And the difficulty here is such case that we should potentially drag or nudge or have an incident with the group or change the setting out within the group. We can negatively impact the setting out of the elements outside of the group. So needless to say, you can see how problematic this could become. Even something like a nudge, and suddenly our overall envelope scheme is completely destroyed just because we nudged an element within a group that had been constrained to outside the group. Okay, so that's tip number 11. Never constrain elements or dimension lock elements or pin elements from within a group to areas outside the group, if that makes sense. So again, just to reiterate that because I made a hames at the last bit, never constrain your grouped elements to elements outside of the group. Tip 12, keep your datum information out of your groups. Okay, so this is one of these things that, while it may seem very obvious, it is very easy for people to kind of click and select all, and suddenly grids and levels are present in a model group. Okay, so datum information, what do I mean by that? I mean, do not include grids, do not include levels, do not include your project base point, your survey point, your internal project point, anything that is a priority one setting out element of your model should not go into groups. Okay, I don't have a visual example of this for you, but what I do have is a descriptive example of experience. Okay, and I have seen instances where people have, let's say, selected a level, integrated a level within a group, copied that group around the model environment, and then someone in section has come along afterwards, a user in section has come along afterwards and seen multiple instances of this level and merely thought that these are just duplicates of the level. Went into the group, deleted the level, unwittingly deleted absolutely everything as hosted to that level across all groups and even elements outside the groups. Okay, so that's just one kind of, most catastrophic use case, but generally it's very, very bad to include your datum information into your model or your detail groups. So just don't do it. Okay, that was tip 12. Tip 13, avoid model attachments in Revit. So going back to our screen here, okay, we have this wall arrangement here, okay, and as a rule, you do not want to, if you're grouping walls, you should avoid grouping them with a top level constraint. So for example, in this instance, I could select this and you can see that I have it unconnected at 3 meters high. All right. You do not want to append this to something like level 1. And the reason for that is the levels are variable. So you might have a level 1 with an offset value of -350 to account for the structural buildup of the floor above. Okay. But you may, across the building where you're copying this group, that underfloor level may alter throughout. Okay, so really you need to kind of dictate. You kind of have to pick your poison with this one. You have to understand why it makes sense to not connect certain walls and when it does make sense. Okay, now that doesn't mean to say that you can't copy groups and have the walls, let's say, attached to something that's designated. Okay, so pulling a section up through here at the moment. Okay. Select my walls. I'll actually smooth that back so I get the full selection. You can see that I have this overhead, this floor overhead, and we have our walls here. Okay, so I can group all elements there, and I can group them. I can say, okay, this is group 1, so I'm just going to call them walls. All right. And with that, I can edit the group, select the walls, and I can attach the top face. Okay, and I can finish, and then whenever I copy that, the same attachment will be there. But what's interesting about that is the groups kind of act almost as a per instance family in this particular use case, whereby if I have that group and I copy that group, and I'll just copy it again for when I edit that group and then I make the attachment after that, it'll only attach the first instance. It won't attach every instance. So attachments in Revit groups are a little bit tricky. Generally, if you're adding walls to your groups, you should have them at an unconnected height and dictate what that unconnected height is throughout and expect there to be variation. And that means on a per group basis, then you can go through section and you can, on each instance, attach the top level of your walls just to close out the geometry. But it's worth noting that can be done. And further to that, let's assume, I'm just going to move this across, sorry, apologies. I'm just going to move this out of the way here. And let's say I move that floor to here. I know I've got duplicate instances, but I'm actually going to give that an offset of 1500. Okay. This can, even though it's part of the same group, you can attach that instance of that group to the underside of the floor above. So it's important that you do not attach the actual walls to a level in this instance, because the level is variable, but that on a per group instance, you go through and you select the walls and you attach them to the geometry that they're going to fix the head detail to. Okay, so yeah, that was step, what step was that now? I'm losing track of myself at this point. That was step 13, avoid model wall attachments in Revit. Step 14, know when to use nested families instead of groups. Okay, so looking on screen here today, we've gone back to our trusty workstation example, and this here would be if you look at these, this is all individual family components that I've brought into the model. Okay, and this here, a lot of early beginner users might select this and group it and call it workstation 1 or whatever, and then would proceed to make copies. Okay, but the difficulty is, as alluded to earlier on in the video, they will then end up eventually becoming potentially nested groups within the Revit model. So not only are you populating the model with too many groups in terms of the scheduling, so again, if I go into my ever expanding group schedule, you can see that we have our workstation 1 there present. Not only are you introducing kind of noise, let's say, to the group controls within the project, it's also too many groups. You know, it's too small an element to consider grouping, and it's also just an ineffective way of creating groups, because then you cannot meaningfully nest them within larger groups. Okay, so in an instance like this, you're as well using something like a nested family. So just to give you an example of a nested family, here I produced one very quickly. Okay, so I didn't get all the bric-a-brac on the table, but you can see, for example, the power with the nested families is not only do you get the full arrangement there and present, but you can actually embed parametric properties within it. So for example, on this locker here on the right hand side, I can actually change that locker type and size from directly within the family editor. Okay, and what's really interesting about that is if you imagine that we had a series of these, which were then grouped, we can go into the edit group, okay, but we can change these properties, but they're per instance properties. So we can actually get a massive amount of control. Like, just for example, I can actually swap out with any family currently in that nested family arrangement. So I can actually put another chair there. Obviously it's not presentable, but what we end up doing is getting a great degree of flexibility within our overall group structure by just turning on and off a couple of the visibility or presentation toolboxes or parameter boxes on the nested family itself. Okay, and that gives us a lot of variation between it. But most importantly, it means that we can have our families nested within a Revit group, and we don't have to go from the overall group into the nested group to make edits to the actual the workstation arrangements here. We can do it specifically either in the family outside of the project, or if we're intelligent about how we set up the nested parameters, we can the nested family parameters we can control with visibility boxes and that kind of stuff directly from in the project browser. And again, it actually remembers, so because it's per instance, it remembers the original configuration as well, one copied out. Okay, so you can get the first one the way you want it. So for example, we may opt to have an arrangement that has these two lockers at the end as a visibility click box, and that means we can have nested family, nested family, nested family with the on-off visibility for the two lockers at the end. And that means we can basically just have a whole arrangement of nested families within our group without any issues or any of the caveats that were present in step 2 when we were talking about nesting families. Okay, so I think that was a step or tip 14, when to use nested families. Tip 15, do not use corridor, party, or exterior walls within your Revit groups. Okay, so when you're in the early stages of project development, you may feel that, okay, I'm going to actually group an allotment of rooms or something within an outer wall box, and then you copy that around. But as the project detail begins to develop out, you begin to realize that, for example, the party wall condition may not be consistent throughout. The corridor wall condition may not be consistent throughout. In this example, if you imagine we had another arrangement here on the right hand side, if we were to include the party wall in the group and then we were to copy it over to here, we have a conflict then, because on one group we'd want the exterior wall to be on the right hand side, but on the same group, let's say if there was another one on the right hand side, this right hand one would want that exterior wall, but the left hand one here would want a party wall. So by including the party or the corridor or the boundary walls, you're actually convoluting the groups, and you might end up with multiple variations of groups for what is essentially the same internal fit out of the space. So I like to think of it as a hierarchy, and what I think of it as the envelope for the space which you want to group elements from should remain independent of the actual grouped elements within it. That's not to say you can't have shared, like the internal walls and that kind of thing, or the internal doors and all that information as part of the group. That's fine. It's more got to do with what you're including and what you're not. And really, I kind of look at the party, the corridor, and the boundary walls as a higher hierarchy, a more important thing to maintain the integrity of, and therefore to be left outside the groups. And also purely from the practical sense, as I just described, it's not the same everywhere. In one instance where you have a party wall, you may want to have an exterior wall in the next group instance. So it just doesn't lend itself to duplication around the actual file. Okay, that was tip 15. Do not use party, corridor, or exterior walls within your Revit groups. Tip 16, when to use a Revit assembly in lieu of a Revit model group. Okay, so looking at the grouping methodologies in Revit, okay, Revit is really powerful for grouping elements that you want to copy and array and spread out all across the project. So for example, internal room arrangements, all that kind of thing. All right. Assemblies, a good kind of mental indicator of when you should consider using an assembly instead of a group is if you have a collective or a category of objects, let's say, that you want to document independent of the context that is around them, okay, or in isolation from the overall context of the building. So to give you a couple of good examples, galley kitchen is a very good example of an assembly where you can just select all the elements, and rather than grouping them, you can actually create an assembly for them, because that means you can automate the drawing production for the assembly off the back of it. You can tag it, that kind of thing. And that means that assembly can just go straight out the door to the kitchen fabricator. Okay. Another good instance would be something like modular construction. You may have repeat panelization of walls, and therefore, even though there is a contextual element, because the sockets and the locations of the services and the structure and everything of that is standardized, you can actually create an assembly of that full wall panel and generate all the drawings associated with that assembly, which ties really neatly into the fabrication information. Okay, so again, going back to our workstations here, we could click and drag and create a group out of all this if we wanted, but up beside it there, we can create assembly, and I'm just going to call this furniture 001. And you can see down here on the right hand side, we have a furniture 001 assembly that's actually being created in our project browser. Okay. From there, we can right click and you can say create assembly views, and it can create a whole host of views off the back of that. Okay, so I'm going to press OK. I'm just going to let it create all of them. I'm going to let it run. Hopefully kill the project. I may have been a bit too ambitious. And here you can see we've actually immediately generated an assembly view. It's a plan view of the let's say the grouping of tables. Now it's not a group, it is an assembly of the table items, okay? But then these can actually inherit independent tags and that kind of thing. So you can go straight here. I can go into this view here and I've got a section through the assembly. I can go through the end. So you can see that you basically generate all your views and sections and stuff. And even it goes as far as to say that you have your material takeoff. So you can go in here to your schedule, you can say fields, and on your filter sorting, you can change the material by name. And on our sorting grouping, you can say sort by material name, and you can turn off itemize every instance and put a footer and a grand total and press OK and lose it. Apparently I did something incorrect there. Oh, sorry on my filter. I didn't mean to filter. Press none. There you go. And as you can see that we have our full material list off the back of that assembly that can go to the fabricator. And outside of that, we have a parts list as well, which itemizes all the different families that were part of that assembly. So really, if you need to document elements independent of the context of the building, then assemblies might be the way to go in lieu of groups, all right? And stay tuned, follow the channel, make sure to subscribe. I'm going to do a detailed breakdown of an example of working through a full model and all associated assemblies for a fabrication process, just so you know. So it's in the pipeline. It might be a while then, though. Okay, so I believe that was step 16, which is know when to use an assembly in lieu of a model group in Revit. Tip 17, how to save your model group out into an independent Revit project file. So let's just say we are, again, I'm just using this as an example. I don't believe that this is an example of a group that you should group, but it's just what I have to hand. Okay, so let's just say we want to group our workstations again. And we think that this is a particular grouping of elements that we would like to use for future projects. A good example of this might be something like a disabled access wash closet or bathroom design that you know is going to recur multiple instances for projects from now until the end of time, basically. You may want to actually just create a group of let's say create a group of the elements that would make that a compliant disabled access wash closet, group them, and then publish them out into a file that can be linked into any other model going forward. Okay, so by selecting the group, we can press the link. We can say replace with new project file, and just generally I can give it the same as group name. Okay, and what's really important is when I'm saving that now, it's going to cease to be a group in our project. It's going to open another file, okay, temporarily, and it dropped away. But you will notice now that when I select this, it's not showing me the edit group options anymore. It's actually showing me the bind link or the manage links. And you can see here that's deemed a Revit link. Okay, and when I go into our manage links dialog, go into our our Revit file, you can see workstations or VT is loaded. Okay, so you can actually publish or send your groups out into independent models. There's another reason you may wish to consider this is if you have someone who's responsible for the interior fit out of let's say again, defaulting back to hotel rooms or something like a dental surgery or a doctor's surgery or something like that, and you have someone who's specific for that role for the project duration, they can manage the group outside of the main project, and then all instances of the link in the main project will update with the changes from the designer specific to that. So if you have a specialist designer, they can work on a grouped element outside of the main project within a link structure, and then all instances throughout the model will update throughout. So that is a really useful thing to know, and it's incredibly beneficial. Okay, so there is a lot of use cases for larger projects for something like that. So that is how to send or publish your Revit model group out into an external Revit file. Tip 18, you can place existing groups from the model directly from the architectural tab. So I think it's a bit of a misconception that you actually need to constantly copy the groups all over the model environment if you want more instances of it. But in fact, you can actually go to your architecture tab here, okay? And looking at the top under model, you can see there's model group with a drop down, okay? So we can place model group and we can select whatever group instance we want. So again, I'm going to say, okay, I'll say kitchen in this instance, and I'm just going to place the kitchen model. There you can see we have our placement of a new group within the model. So rather than going in, because this is a nested family and a nested group in this instance, it'd be very difficult to select that and copy it out. What we'd have to do is we'd have to edit the group, copy that group, that nested group within the group, and then we would actually have to remove the group. So that's a lot more of a convoluted way of, oh sorry, I didn't even manage to to remove it successfully there. We'd actually have to remove the group just to place the element. So from the architectural tab, thankfully, we can go straight into our model group. We can place our model. We can pick whatever arrangement that we want to place, and we can replicate it wherever we want throughout the model. That was tip 18. Place your Revit groups directly out of the architectural tab options. Tip 19, move your Revit Group Origin point to a sensible location. So what is the Revit Group Origin point, I hear you ask? So if I go to my architecture tab there, and I go to place one of my groups, again, place model group, and I'm going to select our office arrangement A and pop it in. But I got a warning about rooms for. Okay. So you can't see it in this view, okay? Or sorry, apologies. You can't see it in this view. You can see this little XY axis here, okay? And if I go into the plan view here for the same, okay, you can actually move that point to a sensible new location, okay? So why this is pretty important is that I can, first of all, deleting that instance of the group and selecting the original group that it was originated from, okay? Try not to place it at a wall intersection or something like that, because that is less fixed. Again, referring back to earlier points, if we had a party wall in one group, that is then the boundary wall in the next group, the overall setting out of that wall is going to be different. The size and shape of it is going to be different. Construction is going to be different. So placement of the actual the origin point against something like a wall intersection doesn't make sense, because it's not as fixed for the project duration. However, something like a grid intersection is perfect, okay? So in this instance, you can see that we have multiple grids going across the project, okay? And I would like to place it on grid 3D, okay? So moving the origin point, I can select it there, and I can bring it down to hopefully snap to the point I want it. And unfortunately, I've made things a little bit convoluted, but there you go. Now, that is on grid 3D. And what's important about that then is when I'm placing the architectural model, again, I can go architecture model, sorry, apologies, I can never find it first time, placing group, okay? It actually, it's the origin point that I recognize as my placement. So I can pick the corresponding intersection of the grid, and the set out is exactly the same between the grid intersections. So rather than copying constantly from one intersection to another intersection or a fixed point, you can actually pre-designate your origin point for the group, and then just place it directly where you need it. Okay. What's also really powerful about the origin point is that you can actually give it, apologies, you can actually give these values offsets. So that's okay. So I can actually give the origin point an offset of 200, or actually I'll make it a little more drastic so it's legible. 1200 in this instance. Okay. I'm going to adjust limits. And these are all ignorable warnings, don't worry too much about them. But when I go to the model group test, you can see that our office arrangement A and the nested kitchen within that both have their origin level offset now to 1200. So you can actually track the respective start points of your origin levels for all of your groups via the schedules. Okay, so this is particularly useful if you have half landings or if you have smaller mezzanine levels or something like that, where the repeating group is still applicable. It just has to pop up off of the main host level by a value. Okay, and again, go to the default 3D. You will see that we're actually hovering the 1200 mil above the floor. Now, one element there. This is just something to note. One element within our group has actually not gone up that 1200, and I'd have to actually look at why that is. It could be that it's a host element and it's actually glued to the first floor. So it's just to be cognizant that that is not a seamless thing to do. But once you work it out, once it's fine for the project duration. So that is why you should manually relocate and position your model group origin point in Revit. It just makes the placement and the replication of information that much easier, and allows you to control the respective, let's say, elevation of your group relative to its host floor level, should there be any variance across your building. Tip 20. Revit groups are for multiple instances, not just the one. Okay, so if you find yourself creating a group of elements, but that group of elements or that collective of elements is not required in other places throughout your project, then there's no need to group it. It doesn't deserve a group, and all you do is increase the friction for you editing that collective of elements. So if there's only one collective grouping of elements in the project, then you don't need to create a model group for it. You just keep it as individual elements, or you use something like a nested family or something, depending on what that collective consists of. All right, so that is number 20. Don't use a group for a single instance in a project. Tip 21. Ceiling hosted families can be problematic in groups. Okay, so here we have the world's worst lighting arrangement on a host ceiling. Okay, and the whole thing has been grouped. Okay, so let's say, for example, I copy that group over there. Okay, and I go into this group and I was making a few edits. Okay, so let's say I was just moving the alignment, let's say, of all of this line. Apologies, sorry. This line of fittings for some reason. Again, forgive the design, but I press finish. Okay. While this is a relatively simple example, I've seen instances where ceiling hosted elements, they fall out of the model or they disappear entirely from the model. They fall out of the group or disappear entirely from the model when they are grouped and you've made an edit to that group. And there is a little bit of a trick which you can do in order to secure the position of all ceiling elements before you close the group. Okay, so this is something for the electrical and mechanical engineers for the most part, as well as any architectural people who might be doing schematic ceiling designs. But what I would say to you is this: if the ceiling is grouped, okay, and you have all your services hosted, the last thing you should do before you leave the group is you should select everything. Okay, you should filter, turn off the ceiling boundary itself, and anything else that isn't a ceiling hosted element. And then using the nudge keys, just nudge up once and nudge down once. And there's something about that process that stops the group breaking the hosting of the elements to the ceiling. So the elements don't fall away from either the group or, more importantly, the project. And it's just something to be cognizant of. If you are an M&E designer or if you're an architect doing a provisional ceiling arrangement, then If you have to group that ceiling and the hosted elements associated, make sure that when you're making edits to that group, final thing you do is do a little nudge up and a little nudge down of the ceiling elements so that none of those elements disappear. You can then finish and the hosting will remain perfectly fine. There's another thing I just want to touch upon before I finish tip 21, and that is earlier on I referenced that ceilings can be a problem when you mirror them because the actual surface pattern can get distorted or the alignment can fall away. I just want to give a quick example, and hopefully it'll work on screen here. But no, it doesn't appear to if it's making a liar of me. But in some instances, that alignment across the ceilings, when the ceiling is mirrored, will actually fail, and you'll end up with your ceiling alignments kind of, let's say, out of whack. No, again, I can't even edit that ceiling alignment. Oh, sorry, it's in the group. Apologies. So you may end up with something like this taking place after you have mirrored your ceiling. Okay, so it's just to be cognizant that again, when you're mirroring ceilings, to keep an eye on the pattern every time you do the mirror of the group, so that the pattern doesn't get distorted and rearrange itself. So yeah, most importantly anyway, make sure to nudge your ceiling hosted elements before or after, okay, or before you finish your group edits in Revit, okay. And tip 22, the last and final one, make sure to name your groups intelligently. Be descriptive. Use a kind of a descriptor or a project-wide, let's say, volume designation or something sensible to name your groups. You don't name your groups sequentially. Don't have group 1, group 2, group 3, group 3, 2, 3 bracket 2, 3 bracket 3, group 3 final, group 3 final 1. This is real college stuff. Don't do it. All right. Name your groups. Be descriptive. Use the functionality of the group as the description. Use the volumes in accordance with the BIM execution plan that the groups belong to as a designator as well, so that when people are reviewing the data in the schedules, they can see the actual position of the groups just from the schedules. Okay, so just think laterally, think across the project time frame, think who's going to be looking for the information, and make sure that you're naming things sensibly. All right, everyone. So I think that is about me. I think so. I think that's it. All right. As ever, if you enjoyed it, you know what to do down below. I've also set up a Buy Me a Coffee portal page. So if you like what I'm doing here, if you're getting value out of it, please go ahead and feel free to support me over there. It would be nice to be able to justify to my wife and my little children why on St. Patrick's Day I'm sitting in my garden office talking about Revit rather than out enjoying the sun. So if you appreciate what I'm doing here, go ahead and please help out. But if not, of course you can. There's no pressure. I'm going to do it anyway. All right. As ever, if there was something that I missed out, if there's some useful tip or tidbit that you want to include for other users to come across, make sure to leave it in the comment section below. And I will see you for the next one. I'm exhausted. I'm calling it a day. See you later. Bye bye.